June 1945. The air in Okinawa was thick with the smell of smoke and sea salt, and filled with dust from collapsed walls and splintered trees. Rain drizzled down from clouds that were still heavy with gunpowder. The hills, which had once been covered in sugarcane, now lay flattened, carved by shell fire. Amid the ruins of a village schoolhouse, its chalkboards cracked, its desks scattered, footsteps approached cautiously. An American sergeant moved through the debris, rifle raised and eyes scanning every shadow. He had been warned to expect ambushes and fanatical last stands. His boots crunched over shattered glass. In a corner he saw movement. Out of the rubble emerged a boy. His uniform was too big for his narrow shoulders, and his helmet was sliding down over his brow. He clutched a stick with a strip of white cloth tied to the end in his hands. The cloth trembled in his grasp. His eyes darted around, wide with terror. He had been told that surrendering would mean torture, that the Americans would kill him slowly, that lowering his weapon would invite shame worse than death. Yet his knees buckled under the weight of hunger. His lips were cracked, and his face was pale. The flag fluttered because he had no strength left in his arms. Behind him, 2 more children stumbled from the ruins. They were smaller, and their rifles dragged in the mud as if pulled by bodies too weak for the task. Their faces were hollow, their skin stretched tight over bone. The sergeant hesitated. He thought of his own son in Ohio, who was 12 years old and still slept with a baseball glove under his pillow. These children were the same age, yet they wore uniforms and carried weapons that were too heavy for them. The sergeant lowered his rifle. He pulled a canteen from his belt, unscrewed the cap, and held it out. The boy flinched, expecting a blow. But when the water touched his lips, his entire body shivered. He drank greedily, coughing, and with tears running down his dirt-streaked cheeks. Another soldier reached into his pack and produced a Hershey's bar. Wrapped in silver foil, it caught the light. The boys recoiled at first, whispering that it must be poisoned. Yet hunger was stronger than fear. One of them tore at the wrapper with trembling hands and shoved the chocolate into his mouth. The sweetness shocked him. His eyes widened as he tasted something other than bitterness for the first time in months. The Americans watched in silence. They were supposed to be enemies, yet they looked like lost sons, barefoot, ragged, and starving. Their rifles lay forgotten in the mud. The sergeant motioned for them to follow him. Slowly and unsteadily, they obeyed. As they walked away from the ruins, the sun broke through the clouds. The battlefield behind them was still smoking, but the path ahead led to the American lines. Tents were set up and medics were waiting with bandages while cooks stirred pots of rice. The boys walked, clutching pieces of chocolate and sipping water as if holding relics. They had expected death. Instead, they were being led towards life. The moment was seared into their memories. 3 children in uniforms that were too big for them, carrying scraps of food in their hands and walking beside men who had been described to them as monsters. Everything they had been taught collapsed in that instant. History often turns with the sound of gunfire, but on that day it turned with the sound of water pouring from a canteen and the crackle of chocolate foil. Sometimes the most decisive victory does not come from a bullet, but from a meal. The war for these children did not begin with bullets. It began with chalk dust on blackboards and the voices of teachers reciting slogans that stuck in the memory. In classrooms across Japan, arithmetic problems had become lessons in killing, and poems had become oaths of loyalty. By 1943, the message was everywhere. Surrender was shameful, death was a duty, and Americans were demons. The Ministry of Education issued circulars that stripped schools of their innocence. Boys were told that they were not students, but soldiers in training. Girls were told that their future lay not in motherhood, but in martyrdom, as nurses in tunnels and caves. Banners with bold brushstrokes were displayed on the walls of classrooms. Die before you surrender. In one rural school, a teacher made his pupils copy the phrase until their hands ached. a boy in Kagoshima, wrote in his diary in uneven, childish handwriting, "We must die before the Americans touch our soil. If I die, my younger brother will take my place." He was 14. His classmates applauded these words not because they understood them, but because their teachers did. It was obedience disguised as honor. In 1944, the government created the Volunteer Student Corps. Although the name implied choice, it was actually compulsory. Boys as young as 12 and girls barely 15 were mobilized in schools across the islands. On Okinawa, they became the Iron and Blood Corps, with a strength of nearly 2,000. Some were issued rifles. Others carried grenades tied to their belts. Many received only bamboo spears, sharpened to a point. They wore armbands that declared them to be soldiers, although their bodies still looked childlike. Propaganda made the enemy appear monstrous. Posters depicted Americans with fangs and claws. Radio broadcasts described them as beasts who burned villages and tortured children. Magazines for boys featured comic strips of students throwing themselves under tanks while clutching explosives to their chests. Teachers warned, "If you are captured, you will be defiled. It is better to die like a shattered jewel than to live in shame." Girls were not spared. The Himayuri student nurses, aged between 15 and 19, were marched into caves that had been converted into hospitals. They swabbed blood with their bare hands and pressed cloth against gaping wounds. They were told that when the Americans came, they must take their grenades and use them on themselves. Some carried the weapon like a sacred amulet, brushing their fingers over it in the dark, as others might a rosary. In one classroom, a teacher asked a boy to solve a problem on the board. If one tank holds 10 Americans and you destroy it with 2 grenades, how many enemies will you kill? The chalk squeaked as the boy wrote the answer. His classmates nodded as though it were normal. Meanwhile, across the ocean in an American classroom, another boy of the same age was solving problems about apples and trains. The contrast could not have been sharper. The boys crouching in caves in Okinawa carried those lessons like armor. Their teachers had warned them that capture would result in unspeakable suffering. They imagined teeth and claws, monsters lurking in the darkness. They had grenades for hearts, bamboo for hands, and fear for minds. As he waited, one boy traced the emperor's words in the dirt with his finger. "Death is lighter than a feather," his teacher had told him. "Surrender is heavier than a mountain." He whispered the phrase until his voice cracked. When the ground shook with the approach of American soldiers, he closed his eyes and gripped his weapon tighter. Before they encountered soldiers, they encountered phantoms. Before they saw Americans, they saw monsters painted on walls. The cruel irony of war was that children were taught to fear enemies before they even knew what an enemy was. Yet the moment the canteen was offered and the chocolate melted on their tongues, the image shattered. The propaganda that had been built up over years collapsed in seconds. Everything they had been told dissolved into confusion. The classroom had armed them with lies. The battlefield would disarm them with food. The cave smelled of smoke, sweat, and damp stone. Drops of water slid down the walls, mingling with the grime on the boys' uniforms. They crouched in the dark with their weapons in hand and their hearts pounding in their chests. Some held Arisaka rifles that were far too long for them. Others clutched bamboo spears unevenly sharpened with knives. One boy pressed a grenade swaddled in cloth to his stomach as if it were a holy object. They whispered to each other, their voices cracking with fear. Their teachers had told them what was coming. Capture meant torture. Capture meant shame. It was better to pull the pin, to leap into the fire and die, than to live as a coward. These words echoed in their ears louder than the artillery fire above. Outside, the sound of boots drew closer. Gravel shifted under heavy footsteps. The boys tensed, gripping their weapons tighter. Their eyes darted towards the cave mouth, where a faint glow of daylight seeped in. They had waited weeks for this moment. They expected monsters to appear. They expected to see claws and fangs, and to hear voices cursing in an unknown language. Then a new sound came, a voice amplified through a megaphone, words broken yet recognizable. "Come out. You will not be harmed. Lay down your weapons. We have water. We have food." The boys froze. Their minds raced. Was this a trick? Was this the bait before the torture? Suddenly, a flare burst at the entrance, flooding the cave with light. The children squinted, their eyes burning. They saw the silhouette of a figure entering, crouched low, helmet gleaming. An American sergeant stepped into view. His rifle hung at his side. Instead of a weapon, he carried a canteen and a chocolate bar. The boys gasped. Their arms shook as they raised their rifles, but no shots were fired. Their hands were trembling too much. The sergeant moved slowly and carefully. He unscrewed the cap of the canteen, took a sip himself, and held it out. The gesture was deliberate. It said, "This is no poison. This is water." One boy, older than the rest with sunken eyes from hunger, stepped forward. He took the canteen with both hands, brought it to his lips, and drank. The liquid spilled down his chin, and his body shuddered, but he continued to drink. He did not die. He did not scream. He lived. The sergeant broke the chocolate bar in half. He put a piece in his mouth, chewed and swallowed. Then he offered the rest to the boy. A gaunt, hollow-eyed boy snatched it, tore at the silver wrapper, and shoved the chocolate into his mouth. The sweetness stunned him. His body trembled as the taste spread across his tongue. It was more than just food. It was the end of fear. At the back, another boy pressed his forehead against the stone wall. His mind swirled with his teacher's words. "The Americans will kill you slowly." Yet here was his comrade, alive and well, chewing chocolate with a faint smile on his face. The boy's chest tightened. The world he had known was crumbling. Outside, more soldiers waited with their weapons ready, but their eyes were soft. They had seen too many children blow themselves up with grenades. They had seen families leap from cliffs. They had been told to save lives if they could. Tonight, they saved children. The rifles clattered to the ground. Bamboo spears fell into the mud. A grenade, pin still intact, was placed on a rock. One by one, thin figures emerged into the daylight. They blinked in the sunlight, still clutching pieces of chocolate and bottles of water in their hands. The Americans looked at them in disbelief. They were enemies, yes, but also children. One soldier whispered, "Christ, they're just kids." Another thought of his son in Kansas, who was the same age and was safe at home. The contrast burned in his chest. That night the boys sat in the camp holding tin cups of rice and soup. They ate slowly, their eyes darting at every movement of their captors. Yet with each spoonful, their fear ebbed. Hunger yielded to confusion, and confusion yielded to a fragile calm. They had expected death. Instead, they received life. Years later, the sergeant who had carried the canteen told his son, "I aimed at an enemy soldier. Then I saw that he was just a boy. All I could do was feed him." History often turns with explosions. In Okinawa, it turned to the sound of water being poured into a tin cup and the crinkling of chocolate foil in a trembling boy's hands. The night in the American camp was filled with an eerie silence. The guns had stopped. The air smelled of wet canvas, boiled rice, and medicine. The boys sat on low cots, their bodies weak, and their eyes wide with suspicion. They were waiting for the cruelty their teachers had promised them. Instead, men in white gloves moved from bed to bed, carrying bandages and bowls. One boy pressed himself against the wall, clutching his arm where shrapnel had torn the skin. He expected a knife, a blow, or a jeer. But a medic knelt in front of him instead, speaking softly in a language he could not understand and pouring clear liquid over the wound. It stung, and the boy winced, certain that this was the torture he had been expecting. Then came the bandage, wrapped firmly and neatly like a gift. The pain eased. The boy stared at the strip of white cloth. His teacher had told him that the Americans would cut up his body. Instead, they had bound it with care. Another boy coughed until his chest shook. A nurse in a Navy uniform lifted a spoonful of broth to his lips. He turned his face away, certain that it was poisoned. She smiled, tasted a spoonful herself, and held it out again. He hesitated, then opened his mouth. Warmth slid down his throat. His eyes watered, not from sickness, but from the realization that someone wanted him to live. On another bed, a boy with a swollen ankle whimpered as a surgeon leaned over him with a scalpel. He thought of the grenade his teacher had pressed into his hand and the promise of an honorable death. Now a stranger was cutting open his skin, draining the infection, and sprinkling white powder into the wound. The boy braced himself for agony, but when it was finished, the throbbing faded. He looked at the surgeon and whispered a question that went unanswered. Why would an enemy save me? Around them the camp glowed with the light of lanterns. Soldiers who had fought their way through machine gun nests were now carrying trays of soup. Marines who had stormed beaches tucked blankets around children. Their faces were lined with exhaustion, but their hands moved gently. Some of them thought of their sons, who were the same age and were waiting at home. Others thought of the friends they had buried in the Okinawan mud. They had come to kill, but tonight they were there to heal. The boy's disbelief was almost unbearable. Each act of mercy struck against the walls built in classrooms like a hammer. They had been told to fear claws and teeth. Instead, they saw steady hands wrapped in bandages. They had been told to expect laughter at their pain. Instead, they heard voices, soft with concern. They had been told to prepare for death. But they were being prepared for sleep. In the dark, whispers passed between cots. Why did they feed us? Why do they care if we live? One boy stared at the ceiling, recalling his teacher's words, "Death is lighter than a feather." But when he touched the bandage on his arm and felt the tightness of the clean cloth, he thought that perhaps life was even lighter. The Americans, too, wrestled with contradictions. Many had lost friends in caves where children had thrown grenades. Many had seen civilians leap from cliffs, convinced that capture would be horrific. Now, they looked down at the thin faces of those half buried in blankets. They wrote home about it. One Marine told his wife, "We gave chocolate to boys who should be in school. They looked at us as if we were angels. This is the strangest war I have ever known." Laughter flickered through the camp. It started with someone coughing, then someone giggling, and then it grew as the children compared the taste of chocolate and bread. They started laughing awkwardly, then louder and louder, until the sound filled the tents. For the Americans, the noise was healing. For the boys, however, it was terrifying in its novelty. They had not laughed since the war began. The medics noted this in their journals. They called it shock, but not the kind caused by wounds. It was the shock of being treated like humans. Psychologists would later coin the term empathy shock to describe it. For children raised to believe that mercy was impossible, its arrival shattered their world. One soldier watched a boy fall asleep with a half-eaten cracker still in his hand. He whispered to his comrade, "This is victory, not medals or territory. This." His comrade nodded in silence. The boys had uneasy dreams that night. In their sleep they heard the voices of their teachers and the screams of their classmates and the orders to die. But when they woke, the first things they saw were soup steaming in a tin cup and a guard smiling faintly at them. Gradually, the voices of death faded away. Gradually, the truth of life grew louder. The propaganda had promised monsters. Instead, they found men. In that discovery, their world began to change. The camp awoke with the first light of morning. Steam rose from pots in the mess tent, carrying the smell of rice and weak coffee. Marines moved about with practiced efficiency, checking rifles, rolling up blankets and calling out to one another in English. On the far side of the barbed wire fence, Japanese boys sat cross-legged on the ground, clutching tin cups filled with soup. Their eyes shifted nervously from the guards to the food, as if either might vanish at any moment. The Americans were already reeling from the shock. In previous days they had faced charges from children carrying sharpened sticks and boys running with grenades in both hands. They had fought men in caves, but also schoolboys whose helmets slid over their ears and whose rifles dragged in the dirt. One Marine shook his head, still haunted by the memory. "They came at us like soldiers," he muttered, "but they were kids." The boys themselves sat in equal disbelief. The enemy had not tortured or mocked them. Instead, they had been fed and given bandages. They had been shown the mercy that their teachers had said did not exist. One boy stared at the bread in his hand and whispered to his friend, "They smile when they eat. Why do they smile?" He could not remember the last time he had seen an adult smile in real life rather than on a propaganda poster. American soldiers searched the abandoned caves and schoolhouses. In notebooks, they found strange lessons, arithmetic problems about killing enemy soldiers in tanks. The pages were filled with drawings of explosions and slogans about noble death. They compared these to their own children's school books back home. Apples, trains, and baseball statistics. The contrast was unbearable. A Marine from Kansas found a diary written in neat, careful handwriting. In it, the boy had written, "If I die, my younger brother will take my rifle. If he dies, my little sister will carry the flag." The Marine closed the book and stared at the ground. His sister worked in a diner back home, serving coffee to passing soldiers. He whispered, "What kind of world teaches this to a child?" Meanwhile, the boys watched the soldiers in the camp. They watched them throw a baseball back and forth, laughing at missed catches and cheering at clean throws. It was the laughter of older boys, but still boys. The prisoners blinked in confusion. They had been trained to scream when stabbing straw dummies and to chant, "Kill the American," until their throats were hoarse. Now they saw Americans chasing a ball and heard their laughter echoing across the yard. One soldier sat cleaning his rifle while humming a tune. A boy listened carefully, waiting for the martial beat of a war song. Instead, he heard something soft and almost tender. He thought of the songs drilled into him, loud and harsh, and always about death. This melody felt human in a way that he had forgotten music could be. The Americans could not comprehend how children had been given grenades and told to die. They asked one another, "Who hands a weapon to a boy with dirt still on his knees?" The boys could not understand why the Americans gave them soup without asking for anything in return. Both sides sat in wonder, staring across a gap wider than the wire fence. One medic wrote in his report, "The cruelty lies not in their fanaticism, but in those who planted it. They obeyed because they were children. We fed them because we could not do otherwise." The boys' understanding shifted slowly. Each time they spilled soup and were met with patience instead of blows, another brick fell from the wall, built by propaganda. Each time they were shown a smile instead of a knife, another crack appeared. They began to laugh in the evenings, at first cautiously, then more loudly. For the soldiers, that laughter provided strange comfort. For the boys, it was a return to a childhood they had thought was stolen forever. The cultural divide was as evident as the barbed wire that separated them. On one side was a system that had armed children with slogans and bamboo sticks. On the other, a system that armed children with bats and balls. One raised its youth to die, the other raised them to live. The confrontation between these two worlds did not happen through speeches. It happened in silence, in the look exchanged when a child chewed bread and realized that their captor was not a monster. Sometimes the greatest impact is not in violence, but in its absence. The children had expected brutality. They found humanity. In that contrast, their world began to collapse and rebuild all at once. The first days in the camp passed in silence. The boys moved like shadows, their eyes downcast and their mouths tight. They ate little, fearing the food was poisoned. They flinched at every shout and sudden noise. They slept in their clothes, clutching bits of wood or rope as if they were weapons. The barbed wire around the camp wasn't needed to keep them in. Fear itself was the fence. However, the Americans understood that fear could not last forever. They had seen too many prisoners waste away and too many civilians collapse from hunger. So they introduced routine. Every morning the boys lined up for food, rice when the supply ships arrived and bread and powdered milk when they did not. At midday they swept the yard or carried buckets of water. At night they sat on cots while guards patrolled in silence. Gradually the rhythm of the days began to erode the panic. One evening a corporal brought a battered leather baseball into the yard. He tossed it in his hand, then rolled it across the dirt towards the children. At first they froze. One boy picked it up, holding it as if it might explode. The corporal smiled, pointed to his glove, and motioned for the boy to throw it back. The ball bounced weakly and stopped halfway. The soldiers cheered as if it were a perfect pitch. The boy's lips trembled. Then, slowly, he laughed. More boys joined the next day. Throws grew stronger. Catches became more accurate. By the end of the week, shouts of joy echoed through the camp. They no longer shouted death slogans. Instead, they shouted, "Catch and throw." For the Americans, the sound was healing. For the boys, it was a rediscovery of childhood. Meals changed, too. At first, the boys tested each bite, waiting for sickness. But after weeks of not falling ill, they ate freely. They tasted bread, rice, and even thin soup with bits of meat in it. They licked the bowls clean, surprised by their own hunger. One boy whispered to another, "Why would they feed us if they wanted us dead?" It was an unanswerable question, but it lingered in everyone's mind. In the evenings, the guards set up a projector in the mess tent. They hung a sheet on the wall and wound reels of film onto the projector. At first, the boys sat stiffly, not knowing what to expect. Then the screen flickered to life. They saw Charlie Chaplin stumble through a doorway, his hat tumbling into the mud. They saw Mickey Mouse dancing across the screen. Confusion turned to laughter. They laughed until tears ran down their faces. Some clutched their stomachs, gasping for breath, unable to believe that such joy existed. For the soldiers, observing this outpouring of emotion was as strange as any battle. One lieutenant wrote home, "We showed them Chaplin for half an hour. They forgot they were our enemies. Maybe we forgot too." Trust grew slowly but steadily. The boys noticed that the guards were saving extra food for them. They noticed that medics checked their wounds each day without cruelty. They noticed that blankets were tucked around them when the nights grew cold. Each act was small, but together they formed a bridge over the gulf of fear. At night some still cried softly. Some whispered prayers to the emperor, imagining they were holding grenades. But others began to dream of different things. They dreamed of playing games in the yard, laughing at films, and enjoying bowls of warm soup. The grip of death loosened. One boy lay on his bed, gazing at the ceiling. He remembered his teacher's words. "If capture is near, take your grenade." Instead, he thought of the baseball in his hands and the sound of the soldiers clapping when he made a good throw. Whispering into the darkness, he asked, "If this is capture, why did they tell us to die?" Eventually, paper and pencils were handed out. The boys wrote simple Japanese words, sometimes adding English words they had learned from the guards, such as food, friend, and thank you. They passed notes between themselves, practicing the new language. For the first time, their writing did not carry slogans. It expressed curiosity. The camp was filled with new sounds. Wooden bats cracked against makeshift balls. English words were shouted across the yard, mispronounced but full of joy. There was laughter during evening films, the scraping of pencils on paper. These sounds replaced the silence of fear. They were the sounds of trust being built. One Marine wrote to his family, "We fought them with bullets. Now we're fighting their fear with food. We might be winning more this way." The boys themselves could not explain what was happening. All they knew was that each day without cruelty, each game and each film chipped away at the terror that had been instilled in them. They had lived in darkness. Now they were sitting in the light, and it felt strange, almost painful, to trust it. The camps did not erase the war, but they began to restore the idea that life was worth living. For boys who had been taught to die, this was the most radical lesson of all. Victory is not always measured by the ground gained or the enemy defeated. Sometimes it is found in the laughter of a child breaking through the silence, in a baseball rolling across the dirt, or in a spoonful of soup being swallowed without fear. The day the guards brought paper and pencils, the boys could hardly believe it was real. Sheets of crisp, white-lined paper were stacked on the table. Short pencils, worn down from being used by many hands, rolled across the boards. The soldiers motioned for the boys to come forward and take one each. The boys hesitated. They had expected shackles, not stationery. For weeks, their voices had remained silent. They whispered at night, being careful even then. Now, for the first time, they were told that they could write home. The interpreter's Japanese was rough, but clear enough. Letters will be sent to your families. You may write whatever you wish. The boys exchanged nervous glances. Surely this was a trap. Yet the paper remained, waiting for words. At first, the letters were like reports. I am alive. I am in a camp. I obey. The boys wrote whatever they thought was safe, whatever their teachers had drilled into them. But the pencil tips kept moving, and slowly the truth began to slip out. Hunger spoke, gratitude spoke, confusion spoke. One boy wrote, "We eat rice every day, sometimes bread, once chocolate. My stomach no longer hurts." Another wrote, "The soldiers are not demons. They gave us soup. They smiled as we ate." The act of writing was as shocking as the chocolate had been. For years they had filled notebooks with slogans and copied out rescripts and commands to die by heart. Now they were scratching words about life. A boy paused with his pencil above the page. He remembered the last phrase his teacher had made him copy: "Better to die than to surrender." Instead he wrote, "I live." He underlined the word twice. When the letters reached Japan, they were inspected by censors. Office workers opened envelopes and scanned the neat strokes, expecting messages of defiance or tales of cruelty. Instead, they found sentences about food and kindness. "We are alive. We eat rice. They treat us well." The censors frowned. One report noted uneasily that prisoners spoke of Americans with unexpected gratitude. Such words may weaken morale. Families wept when they received the letters. Mothers pressed the paper to their faces as if it carried their son's scent. Fathers sat in silence, reading the same line again and again. "I am alive." These words were worth more than any speech from the emperor. They were proof that not everyone had died. For parents who had already prayed for the souls of their lost children, the letters were a form of resurrection. The boys themselves felt something change as they wrote. Leaning over the paper in the dim light of lanterns, they whispered their sentences aloud, unsure if they were permitted to do so. Their hands shook, not from fear, but from the unfamiliarity of being honest. They compared letters with one another, laughing at small mistakes. Some drew pictures in the margins: an American truck, a bowl of soup, and a baseball. Symbols of life, not war. One evening, a boy carefully folded his letter, knowing it would take weeks to reach home. At the end, he had written words he had never dared to before. "I want to see you again." He closed the envelope and handed it to the guard. For the first time since entering the cave months earlier, he felt hope. In a farmhouse in Kagoshima, a mother studied her son's handwriting by candlelight. He had written, "They gave us water when we surrendered. They did not kill us. They gave us food." Shaking her head, she remembered the posters that showed Americans as beasts. Whispering into the quiet, she asked, "Then why did they make our children afraid?" The letters did not stay confined to families. Neighbors gathered to hear them read aloud. Villages whispered the words. Rumors spread. The Americans were not demons. They were feeding children and letting them live. Doubt began to creep into the cracks of propaganda. If the enemy could show mercy, then perhaps everything they had been told was a lie. In the camp, writing became a ritual. Each evening, boys would hunch over tables, their pencils scratching as they filled pages with fragments of new life. The guards watched quietly, sometimes helping to fold the envelopes. This moved them as much as battle had. One chaplain wrote, "We gave them pencils instead of rifles, and in that exchange, we may have saved more lives than on any battlefield." The letters became more than just a means of communication. They were proof. They proved to parents that their children were alive. Proof to the boys that survival was possible. They were proof to a nation that mercy existed. Each envelope contained not only words, but also a challenge to everything they had been told. These children had once been ordered to carry grenades. Now they were carrying messages of life. It was in those fragile pages that Japan's future began to change. The war did not end with a battle, but with a voice. On 15th August 1945, radios across Japan crackled with static and silence before the emperor's words drifted into homes. His voice was faint, formal, and heavy with meaning. It was the first time most people had ever heard him speak. He did not call for victory. He called for surrender. For children who had been told to fight to their last breath, this order was akin to hearing the earth shift beneath their feet. In American camps, boys who had once carried rifles sat frozen as interpreters relayed the message. Their mouths hung open. For months, they had believed that surrendering was worse than dying. Now the emperor himself had told them to stop. They whispered to one another, asking if it was true. Some wept quietly, not from grief, but from relief at being released from a burden that had been too heavy for them. In the weeks that followed, ships and planes carried them home. Their thin figures in patched uniforms stepped onto docks and airfields. Parents rushed forward, some crying so hard that they could barely stand. Many had already performed funerary rites for their sons. Seeing them return alive was like watching ghosts made flesh. Mothers clutched faces they thought they had lost forever. Fathers held hands that were thinner and more bony, but still warm. One boy returned to Kagoshima. His mother fainted when she saw him in the doorway. When she came to, she pressed the letter he had sent from the camp against his chest. She whispered, "You are alive," over and over. He tried to speak, but he could not. Words failed him in the weight of her embrace. At school, the desks had been rearranged and lessons had resumed. But the boys who returned had stories that their classmates could hardly believe. They spoke of water being given freely, of soup being spooned into their mouths, and of films being shown on white sheets that made them laugh. They spoke of soldiers who smiled instead of killing. Other students listened with wide eyes. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned forward, hope stirring within them. The propaganda still covered the walls, but it no longer felt unshakable. In the villages, stories were spreading from mouth to ear. Families gathered at night to hear what the children had witnessed. Neighbors murmured when they heard that the Americans had bandaged wounds and shared food. The whispers grew. Perhaps surrender was not disgraceful. Perhaps mercy was possible. Not everyone welcomed these words, though. Some teachers, still loyal to the old ways, scolded the boys. They muttered that survival was shameful and that death would have been a nobler path. The children lowered their heads, bearing a guilt that was not theirs to bear. Yet their parents defended them. No family would reject a living son. Fathers and mothers preferred shame to loss, life to martyrdom. One boy walked through the ruins of Tokyo. The city was still smoldering from the firebombs. At a junction, he saw American soldiers directing traffic and giving sweets to children. He froze, his mind dragging him back to the cave where he had first encountered chocolate. Fear flickered, then faded. He bowed awkwardly and deeply. The soldier looked surprised, then smiled, and tipped his helmet. The boy's chest tightened. The world had changed forever. Historians later term this a fracture in culture. The returned children became witnesses. Their stories contradicted every poster, slogan, and speech. Their testimonies were more important than any leaflet dropped from the sky. They had been inside the fire and come back alive, bearing truths that no authority could erase. American officials took note. They encouraged the children to speak and write about their experiences. In some camps, they were given notebooks in which to record their memories. Some of these fragile pages ended up in archives, filled with handwriting, recounting stories of rice instead of grenades and bandages instead of blades. One boy wrote, "We were told to die, but when I lowered my rifle, they gave me food. I do not understand this mercy, but I cannot forget it." His essay was read aloud in a community hall, and afterwards the villagers sat in silence, struggling to reconcile what they had been told with what they had just heard. As famine swept through Japan in late 1945, these stories took on new significance. American ships arrived carrying sacks of wheat, powdered milk, and canned goods. Families who had doubted the boys' letters could now see the proof in their kitchens. Mercy was no longer a rumor. It filled their bowls. A boy who had sworn to die for the emperor was now sitting in a rebuilt classroom, sipping milk from a relief program. He looked at the chalkboard where slogans about sacrifice had once been written. Now it displayed arithmetic problems and English words. He whispered to himself, "We live." The change was gradual, resisted by some, but unstoppable. Each survivor's story was like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples outwards. Teachers faltered when they tried to preach the nobility of death. Parents nodded when their children said that the Americans had been kind. The foundation of the old world cracked. Change did not come from generals or treaties alone. It came from the children who had walked out of caves, been fed by their enemies, and carried those memories home. Their stories spread through kitchens, schools, and villages. It was in these words that Japan began to change. They carried their childhood scars into adulthood. For years, many of the boys who had once been ordered to fight and die said little about what had happened. They finished school, walked through ruins, waited in food lines, and rebuilt homes from ash. But inside, the memory of drinking from an enemy's canteen and sharing a chocolate bar lived on, like a seed hidden in stone. By the late 1940s, they were students again. Desks were rebuilt from scrap wood, and textbooks were rewritten by the occupying authorities. Lessons no longer glorified noble death. They spoke of science, democracy, and literature. In one classroom, a boy who had once carried a bamboo spear copied down equations, his pencil moving across the page where his fingers had once gripped a weapon. Looking at the numbers, he thought, "This is what hands are meant to hold." Some went on to university. They studied engineering, medicine, and teaching. They learned to build trains instead of death tunnels, and to heal wounds instead of inflicting them. They taught younger children maths problems about apples and trains, not tanks and grenades. The same boys who had once worn uniforms that were too big for them now wore lab coats, overalls, or teachers' suits. They helped to rebuild a Japan that had been burned to the ground. But they had another mission, even if it remained unspoken. They had lived through propaganda so intense that it had blinded them. They had watched teachers hand them grenades as if they were textbooks. They knew the power of lies. Some of them became teachers themselves, determined never to repeat that cycle. In classrooms in Okinawa, they stood before new generations and told the truth. "We were ordered to die," they said, "but we survived because someone fed us." The students stared in silence, realizing that their nation had once consumed its own children. In the 1960s, as Japan became an industrial power, many of these former child soldiers led seemingly ordinary lives, working in factories and offices. However, when interviewed by historians, they repeated the same story. One man said, "My teacher gave me a grenade. The American gave me rice. That was the turning point of my life." Another wrote, "They fed us. That was the moment I realized that Japan had to change." The shame of surrender gradually transformed into a testimony. For years they felt dishonored for surviving. However, as Japan embraced pacifism and enshrined it in its constitution, their survival became proof that life is stronger than death. Oral history projects in the 1970s and 1980s recorded their stories. They did not speak with pride, but with a warning. "Do not let anyone take your childhood as they took ours," one man told a class of high school students. His voice cracked, but his eyes remained steady. Some survivors became activists, dedicating their lives to peace movements. Survivors of the Student Corps built museums in Okinawa. They collected relics such as uniforms, diaries, and unused grenades. They guided visitors through caves that were once filled with screams. On the walls, they displayed quotes written in neat Japanese characters: "We expected death. We received life." Others quietly carried their memories into family life. They told their grandchildren stories not to frighten them, but to educate them. One man stood with his grandson in front of the cave where he had once crouched with a spear. He said, "I was your age when they told me to die. Instead, an American gave me chocolate. Remember this: kindness is stronger than fear." The boy held his grandfather's hand, his eyes wide as he absorbed the lesson more deeply than he ever would from a schoolbook. Historians have noted that it was these survivors who shaped Japan's post-war identity. Their voices reinforced the national commitment to peace. They embodied the transformation from empire to democracy, and from devotion to death to devotion to life. Their testimonies opposed attempts to revive militarism. They were living reminders of the cost of lies and the power of mercy. As they grew older, their memories became clearer. Some spoke of guilt. Why had they survived when others had died? Others spoke of gratitude. Why had an enemy chosen to save them? But they all spoke of a truth that had never left them. That moment of mercy had shaped their future. And so, in classrooms, museums, and family kitchens, they repeated the same words again and again. They fed us. That was when Japan began to change. Bread instead of bullets. Rice instead of grenades. A spoon instead of a bayonet. Nations often change because of treaties signed or governments toppled. But sometimes, change begins in the memories of children who carried weapons that were too heavy for them, who expected death, but instead experienced kindness. They grew into adults who carried those memories like lanterns, lighting the way for others. The war consumed a nation. Cities were burned to the ground, families were torn apart, and children were turned into soldiers. But when the fighting stopped, the memory that endured most strongly was not the roar of guns, but the taste of food provided by people who had once been seen as the enemy. For the boys who had been forced into uniforms, the moment of surrender meant the collapse of everything they had been taught. They expected torture, but instead they were given bandages. They expected death, but instead they were given soup. They expected to encounter monsters, but instead they met men. This change of heart was more powerful than any battlefield victory. It was the first step towards a new Japan. Mercy could not undo the pain. It did not bring back the classmates who had jumped from cliffs or the girls who had carried grenades pressed to their chests. It did not heal the wounds of lost fathers or leveled cities. But it planted a seed. A single spoonful of rice, a bar of chocolate, or a bandage wrapped with care became symbols that transcended the battlefield itself. Years later, one of those boys, now a grandfather, stood in a classroom surrounded by children looking up at him. He held a piece of chocolate wrapped in foil in his hand. His voice steady, he told them, "This is what they gave me when I surrendered. I was your age. They could have killed me. Instead, they fed me." The children stared in silence. The image was more powerful than any textbook. He clenched his fist around the chocolate and whispered, "That is why I am alive to speak to you." American veterans carried the memory, too. In letters home, they confessed how strange it felt to feed boys who had been their enemies just hours earlier. One Marine wrote, "Victory was not in the battle. Victory was seeing a boy smile with food in his mouth." Another wrote to his mother, "I thought war was only about killing. That day, I learned that it could also mean saving." The cultural clash left its mark on both sides. Japan had raised children to die like shattered jewels. America had raised children to play baseball and eat ice cream. When these two worlds met, one collapsed under the weight of the other. Out of that collapse came the realization that life itself was the greatest victory. For decades afterwards, those who survived spoke quietly at first, but then more loudly. They founded museums, wrote books, and stood before students. They said, "We were children told to die. We lived because someone chose mercy." Their words became part of the foundation of post-war Japan. Their memories became a warning etched in stone. History often counts lives in numbers too vast to imagine. But sometimes it hinges on the smallest of acts: a canteen of water, a bite of chocolate, a steady hand with a bandage. These moments nourished more than just starving bodies. They fostered trust and peace and offered hope of a future without war. In the 1980s, one man, once a boy soldier on Okinawa, walked with his grandson. They passed a baseball field where children were laughing and shouting as a ball soared into the air. The man stopped, remembering the camp and the ball that had once been tossed to him across the yard by an American corporal. Looking at his grandson, he said quietly, "They fed me. That is why you can play here today." The past did not vanish, but it had been transformed. Caves of fear became classrooms of remembrance. Barbed wire became museum exhibits. Grenades became relics under glass. Chocolate, rice, and bread became symbols of the mercy that redefined a nation's future. This lesson was not written in treaties, but in memories. Mercy had proved stronger than propaganda, stronger than grenades, stronger than fear. Mercy fed more than just bodies. It nourished the future.